Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, part 15. Now that we had all we wanted at Halle, we could enjoy the well-planned course and also take full advantage of the lively social life. We had found a cafe where we could dance and meet a good number of the local girls. Later, because we had access to our quarters without actually passing through the gate or the guardhouse, there would often be extended celebrations well into the night. It soon became clear that the various fighter groups from which the students were drawn had very different standards of discipline and demanded considerably differing behavior from their men. Many were already demonstrating that they were used to heavy and regular drinking, whilst some of the others considered it to be fair play to draw and use their Walter PPK pistols quite indiscriminately. Whenever they took it into their heads, they would start shooting, but mostly at night and when they'd had a few drinks. The favorite targets were the electric light standards with their illuminated globes high on the steel poles. I was quite surprised that there was no disciplinary action taken to curb this hooliganism before it had fatal results. At times, I felt that I had to intervene, but was told that it was just standard behavior in their squadrons. On the whole, I just had to let things be, but on one occasion I really hit the ceiling when their tomfoolery came too close for me for comfort. The young officer in the room next door was entertaining a girlfriend when another fellow entered and a nasty situation developed, motivated by jealousy. I was lying on a couch reading and half listening to the hubbub of voices in the next room when there was a sharp crack of 2 pistol shots followed by a burst of flying fragments in my room as the 2 7.65mm bullets burst through the thin partition wall, very narrowly missing my head. That was the last straw. I jumped up and after grabbing my own pistol I burst into the room and threatened to shoot the stupid fellow if he didn't hand over his pistol. This he did when he realized how close the bullets had come to me. I returned the weapon to him the next day and nothing more was said. All things considered, it was fortunate that nobody was seriously hurt or killed, and the incident serves to demonstrate how intelligent young men will behave even if they are part of the military establishment and officers if the rule of discipline is not apparent. The course itself was well conceived and contained everything which we as future Nachrichtenoffiziere would want to know. We were also assured that a letter would be circulated to our commanding officers, stressing the importance of communications and recommending that the subject be given a deeper degree of priority in future planning for equipment and training. That was encouraging, but I wondered if even that would make a dent in the entrenched views of people like our Spaniards and in particular officers with the outlook of Adolf Galland. When the end of the course came, it was in many ways too soon for us. We had had the most fantastic time socially, both in the little cafes in the town and at the Fliegerhorst Casino. Here they had held many festival dance events, and never after we left Halle did I have so many opportunities to wear my Luftwaffe smoking jacket complete with silver-striped trousers. It had been designed for the exclusive use of the Luftwaffe by Göring and was the envy of the other arms of the Wehrmacht. Dressed as we were and now skilled in the social graces, we really felt like something special. Even now, I still recall the warm, heady, happy feeling of the last few months of peace in Germany. Returning to Böblingen, I had the same arrangement with Heinz Deutschle. He took the DKW and I flew the Mi-109D back to the group headquarters, now at Böblingen. We met at Bad Cannstatt and Heinz introduced me to his family and, in particular, to his 2 sisters, Hilde and Liesel. They were rather beautiful, and although friendly to me, they thought that I was still too young to be of interest to them. They were 3 and 5 years older than myself. Nonetheless, the friendship remained, and through it I was introduced to the Stefan family, who also had 2 daughters, Gretel and Marianne. Gretel was about the same age as myself, and we hit it off right from the start. We began to meet quite frequently and played some tennis, took many memorable walks, swam and danced with all the energy of healthy youth. A favorite place for us to visit was something of a local miracle in Stuttgart, the Bundesgartenschau, which is a garden exhibition at the Killesberg. It was a national event, and the whole site had been fashioned out of what had been a wasteland on a hill near to the town. Every day when it was being built, it changed before your eyes, and in what seemed to be no time at all, there were miniature trains, vineyards, a ländische Gaststätte, which is a rural guest house, a cabaret, and all sorts of indoor and outdoor exhibitions. One particular favorite of ours was the indoor-outdoor dancing cafe, and we had gone there one day to enjoy the 5 o'clock tea dancing. We had just settled ourselves at a table when I noticed that Galland and Ewald, the squadron leaders of 1 and 2 squadrons, were seated close by. They, like me, were dressed in civilian suits, and to be polite, I left Gretel and went over to say hello. They wanted to know who my pretty companion was, and for some reason, I still don't know why, I told them that she was my sister, never really believing that they would take me seriously or be interested anyway. I returned to the table and told the story to Gretel, who thought that I was a bit of a joke too. Soon afterwards, I went to the washroom and when I returned, I found one of the two officers happily dancing with Gretel. She returned to the table with a face full of laughter and fun, telling me that she had continued the sister story rather than spoil the joke. More invitations to dance came from the other table, and I was forced to sit at my table alone, the victim of my own foolishness. I thought that was where the story would end, but soon there was a dance at the Böblingen casino, and I was asked to invite my sister, which I did, not knowing really what else to do. Gretel was keen to continue the deception, and as far as I could see, there would be no harm in it. That evening went off well, but another day Gretel visited me at the airport, and as we sat enjoying the sunshine and some coffee in the little open-air cafe between the hangars and the casino, it became apparent that some squadron leaders had started their own private air show, for the benefit of my so-called sister. Well, the time had come to bring the story out in the open, and after so much time, there was no chance that it would be treated like a joke. It just came out as a rather lame prank played on my seniors. It did nothing to improve my relations with Galland, who was still my titular squadron leader, and this was mainly manifest in the singular lack of flying training which was offered to Lieutenant Steinhilper of the 1st Squadron. That was bad, but worse was to come. On April 13th, 1939, the Fighter Group No. 1 of Squadron 433 was officially welcomed to the town of Böblingen. Graf von Pfeil led the parade, which was a grand affair with many stirring marches played by a Luftwaffe band. Speeches were made both by von Pfeil and by the NSDAP Kreisleiter. I really enjoyed leading the Stabskompanie in the parade, goose-stepping past the days with sword presented, marching alone something like 10 meters in front of my steel-helmeted troops. Above us, the Gruppe flew in tight formation, drawing cries of appreciation from the crowds. As they landed at Böblingen, we made our way out from the town to join them. Once assembled, the whole Gruppe took on our new title, First of Fighter Group 52, the unit I was to fly with for the rest of my time as a pilot. Now settled off Böblingen, we worked in good harmony with Lufthansa, who were still using the grass airfield to serve Stuttgart. At this time, Echterdingen, today's Stuttgart Airport, was still in the final stages of construction, like so much building in Germany at the time. When complete, Lufthansa would move their operations there, where they would have concrete runways and more facilities. They were flying Ju-52s and a few Heinkel 70s at the time, and it was okay to operate them from grass, but in the spring and autumn, when the field became waterlogged, the heavy transport experienced some problems. Here, I have to comment that throughout Europe the great renaissance in air transport was taking place, which would, in the end, require most airports to have metalled runways and perimeter tracks. This was of course accelerated by the advent of war, but at this time, the majority of even international airfields had grass runways. Throughout the move to Böblingen and our steady growth as a unit, the command structure had remained basically the same. Numbers 1 and 2 Squadron were still led by Oberleutnants Galland and Ewald, but since the death of Oberleutnant Klein in the Ju-52 crash, the leadership of No. 3 Squadron remained undecided. For a while, Lieutenant Lesmann was appointed on a temporary basis, but later in April, we were introduced to Oberleutnant Kühle, who had served in the Legion Condor. He was to command Squadron No. 3 and was to figure significantly in my later career. In May, nearly all of the pilots, whether NCOs or officers, had been given conversion training from the Me-109Ds to the new and more advanced Me-109Es. I say nearly all because I, for one, had been left out. Either this was because Galland was deliberately ignoring me, or simply because everyone forgot about the Gruppe Nachrichtenoffizier. I was a little upset about that because I felt that my first job was as a fighter pilot and my second responsibility was for communications. I was working hard to improve the Nachrichtenzug skills and efficiency, and I suppose I felt someone should be working as hard with my flying, but for the time being, that was not to be. It began to look like I was getting further away from flying and more involved in the challenging work of communications. Not only was I expected to whip the Nachrichtenzug for the first group into shape, but I was also seconded to the Fliegerhorst Company Böblingen. Here, I was to work with Major Nussbaum, who was a splendid character and a veteran of communications in World War I. He was a popular officer and managed, through his own good contacts and diplomatic cooperation with the Civil Airport and Lufthansa, to gain a lot of professional experience and training for his own Luftnachrichtenkompanie as well as for my Nachrichtenzug. Although I suppose I objected a little to being distanced more from my flying, I could see that Major Nussbaum was an officer who had been overloaded with work and needed some help. He not only had the responsibility for communications for the military side of the airport, but was also supervising the construction of small and self-contained satellite airfields. These were situated around the area for use in case of war. On top of all this, he had to train 60 new reserve operators and only had 3 months to do it. He certainly needed help, and his winning ways and sound man management made it pleasant duty to work with him, albeit that my flying suffered again. It hadn't taken Hauptmann von Pfeil long to convince me that I should be the one to help, and I was given the task of molding the reserve personnel into some sort of military shape and teaching them their basic role as reservists. They were a very lively crowd, mostly 10 or 15 years older than me and drawn from the professional groups with a high proportion of lawyers and other academics. Because of this, I ran into trouble on subjects like Festnahme and Waffengebrauch, which is arrest and use of weapons. There were many searching legal questions as to whether a soldier in uniform, on or off duty, would be required to arrest another soldier or even a civilian, and from where his power and arrest might be derived. There was no doubt that the class enjoyed baiting me and dropping as many loaded questions as possible into the debate. Much of this, I'm sure, was aimed at testing each other as professional colleagues as much as trying to confuse me. I wasn't to be wound up by these vociferous characters and simply sidestepped the issue by joining the class and appointing one of the more active of my audience to take the podium because of his obviously extensive knowledge of the nuances of the law. He soon discovered that it was no easy job to contain and guide such a collection of intellect and talent. The intellectual games aside, they were a good crew and learned their work well. They may have been lively, but they also had a strong sense of responsibility and wanted to play an active part if there ever was to be another war. At the end of their course, we had a really good celebration, which probably involved a little too much wine and beer. They had made up a poem about me, which was recited with much gusto and suitable appreciation for myself to them. At the end of this party, all 60 of them and their training NCOs assembled in military order outside the Gasthaus in the middle of Böblingen, ready to be marched back to the Fliegerhorst. On my order, they were called to attention and we moved out with just one more order. Ein Lied, which means a song. There were many loud and merry songs, some a little risque, others the more traditional marching songs. In any event, the volume was directly proportional to their alcohol consumption. In other words, it was very loud. We arrived back at the base with only minor casualties at about 2 o'clock in the morning and fell into bed exhausted. Next morning, some of the citizens protested to the mayor, who, in turn, passed on the complaint not to Nussbaum but to Graf von Pfeil, who was the official Standortältester, which is the commanding officer, and he called for me, but I really got more of a smile than a reprimand. I was pleased that I wasn't in line for disciplinary action again, as earlier I had blotted my copybook in no uncertain terms. As I have related, the squadrons were converting from the Me-109D to the Me-109E, and my training seemed to be non-existent. I rather impetuously decided to take matters into my own hands. At noon, when I knew that all the other officers were at the casino for lunch, I walked into the hangar for No. 1 Squadron, where I knew a factory-fresh 109E had just arrived. It had not been assigned, and so I told the mechanic who was servicing it to get me a parachute and prepare the aircraft for immediate flight. He unquestioningly carried out my instructions. Discipline in our unit was tight, and NCOs would not normally question the orders of an officer. I strapped on my parachute and climbed up onto the port wing of the 109, pausing to ask the mechanic if there was anything new in the handling notes on this 109E. It was quite different to the old Dora, which is the D model. The Junkers Jumo engine, which weighed 440 kilograms and produced a modest 630 horsepower, had been replaced by the DB601, which was slightly heavier at 600 kilo but produced a phenomenal 1100 horsepower. The mechanic said he thought that the Emils, which is the E model, were being landed slightly faster. I didn't ask any other questions. What he told me had been confirmed by my colleagues. The E model landed best if flown in at about 10 to 15 km per hour faster than the D model. Somewhat nervously, I stepped into the cockpit and dropped down into the close-fitting interior. The aircraft smelled new with a rich mixture of odors, parts still being burned off as the engine began to gain hours and the new parts still being covered with preservative or fresh paint. The mechanic helped to strap me in and I began my pre-flight checks. All was in order. I gave the signal to clear prop and start, and the so-called black man, who was standing on the starboard wing root, began to wind the heavy Eclipse starter. At the right moment, I pulled the lever and the starter turned the great DB601 engine over, roaring into life on the first turn. The whole airframe shook with the power as I made my running checks prior to takeoff. Again, all was in order, and so I gave the signal to clear chocks and I released the brakes. Taxiing around to line up, I opened the throttle and the aircraft leapt forwards, the long engine cowling clearing my view as the tail came up smartly. I was soon in the air. From the beginning, it didn't go too well. Perhaps because I knew I was doing something wrong, perhaps because I was wary of the power of the new aircraft. In any event, I was far from relaxed and enjoying myself. The takeoff wasn't too different, there was a noticeable surge of power and the aircraft seemed to lift off in a shorter run, but once in the air, the handling didn't differ too much. The landing, in contrast, was a bit of a fight. Cutting back on power for the landing seemed to make the aircraft plunge, losing altitude much faster than I was used to. Another problem, which was to prove crucial in my undoing, was a gravel road that crossed the line of the runway. On this day, it was approached at an angle and was very slightly raised. Not enough to cause problems under normal conditions, but if things weren't going too well. I had made 3 circuits, checking myself for the correct altitude and landing speeds. On the 4th approach, I was attempting to find the upper end of the limits for approach speed and was going faster than on the previous approaches. I was pleased, this seemed to be it. The landing was soft and the aircraft handled perfectly. I was almost congratulating myself when I crossed the gravel roadway, which caused the aircraft to jump up a little, flying again for a few brief moments. In those split seconds, I must have recalled my experience of the new aircraft being heavy and tending to drop at low speed. I decided to give it a little bit of throttle just to keep the nose up. I might have gotten away with that one on the D model, but not with the more powerful E model. What happened in those few seconds can be reconstructed by examining the different characteristics of the 2 types of 109. The D model had a single-blade prop and relatively low-powered engine. The E model had a much heavier 3-bladed prop and nearly twice the power of the D model. My quick bit of throttle released 1,100 horsepower onto a heavy propeller, causing a sharp torque reaction in the aircraft, making the fuselage turn on its own axis in the opposite direction of the propeller. The result was that my left wing dropped and touched the ground. Again, there had to be a decision in a split second, so I kicked the rudder hard to the right to bring her round straight again and caused the wing to rise a little, or at least to take the impact away from the wingtip. That worked okay, but I still had lots of forward momentum, which threw the aircraft onwards at an angle of about 45 degrees. The starboard undercarriage leg hit first and folded under, virtually snapping off, with the port leg being bent outwards at a hideous angle. The big, 3-bladed prop hit the ground and began a credible job at plowing the airfield whilst it was twisted and bent backwards like thin tin foil. As suddenly as the cacophony of noise and tortured metal had begun, it was over, and I sat in silence, the harness straps biting into my shoulders and chest. The only sound was the odd ping of hot metal cooling. I released my straps and climbed out of the cockpit to survey the damage. At the same time, I heard the alarm siren and saw figures tumbling from the building to man trucks and begin to rush towards me. It would take a few minutes, and so I took the opportunity to look at the damage. It wasn't too bad. The port wingtip was slightly dented. That wouldn't take long. The undercarriage leg had broken at the point where it had been designed to fracture under these circumstances, but the propeller would be a write-off. Here was the big question. Had I bent the crankshaft on the engine? If I had, then the damage was serious and would keep the unfortunate 109 out of service for quite a while. I was already beginning to weigh up what my punishment might be. Like all sanctions, it would be commensurate with the damage I had caused. The emergency trucks arrived quickly. They knew their business and would soon have the wreck back in the hangar. I was offered a lift back to the ramp in front of the tower, where I could see that the whole complement of on-duty personnel had gathered at the sound of the blood wagon turning out. I decided to walk, both to clear my head and to gain a little more time to gather my thoughts. My reception committee had already quizzed the mechanic and knew that I had taken the aircraft on my own authority and were waiting for my explanation. I could see von Pfeil and Galland, and they took me aside to listen to my story. I admitted that I had acted on my own initiative and tried to explain why. How I felt that I had been left out of training program and how flying seemed to be becoming very low on the squadron's list of activities for me. Hauptmann von Pfeil decided that Galland was my supervising officer and left the disciplinary measures to him. He kept calm, pointing out that through my ill-considered actions I had caused extensive damage to an aircraft that had less than 3 hours flying time in its technical log. He said that he would have to consider the matter and let me know in due course. I suspect that one thing he was waiting for was the complete report of the damage in order that the punishment might fit the crime. The other lieutenants were sympathetic towards me, but we judged the minimum would be 7 days confined to quarters and an entry on my personal dossier. In the event, the aircraft was test flown after just 3 days and there was no damage to the crankshaft. I'm sure that this influenced the decision and Galland called for me to issue my punishment. He would teach me landing and I would have to do it in our own ancient Heinkel 70. Further, I would not have the services of the usual air mechanic and I would have to hand pump the landing gear up and down for each landing. I was to undertake 20 circuits in 4 sessions of 5 and I would only be allowed to complete the landings if Gallant found the direction and approach to be suitable. Under the circumstances I thought that was a fair decision, albeit that Gallant was rubbing my face in my complaint about the lack of instruction. It was better than anyone had expected and for me personally it had 2 distinct advantages. The accident wouldn't go on my dossier and it would give me the opportunity to learn something more about landing. However, it wasn't entirely as clear-cut as it looked. I soon found out that a suitable approach took me very close to the chimney, which was later removed for safety, and very low over the roof of the Clem aircraft factory. A good performance took time, patience and ability, but slowly I began to get there. The landing always had to be made with the wind in the most disadvantageous direction, and it was no easy matter to keep the heavy Heinkel on course and at the correct angle of descent. It was hard to believe that this aircraft had once set world speed records. Things had come a long way in a few short years. I sweated blood flying that aircraft, both from the physical exertion of pumping the landing gear and also from the concentration required to make the successful landings. In the end, I made it, and at last of the 20 landings was over. Ulrich's frustration got the better of him, and he crashed a valuable 109. But we'll talk about that later. First, marching and singing as well as celebrating. I too love a singing march, and this has a long tradition in the German armed forces, and there's even a very precise set of commands to use. You all know Westerwald and Erika, true classics, and singing lifts morale right up, I can assure you. Same goes for celebrations. Ulrich mentions how they sang all night and had complaints from the locals the next day. Well, I can do you one better. We once started celebrating and drinking for one reason or another at the officers' club at around 4:30 p.m. At 5:30 p.m. some neighbors called up the battalion CO and complained about, and I quote, some soldiers throwing up very loudly, too loudly in fact, and if they could keep the volume of said throwing up down please. Well, we too were reprimanded with a smile. But sometimes we have to sanction others. In this case, Ulrich severely damaged a brand new 109. This is something that cannot be swept under the rug, and so he is at the mercy of Adolf Galland. As a result, he had to do some landing practice, and that was it. Lucky, given the circumstances. Again, I can empathize not with crashing planes, but with disciplinary proceedings. As a young first lieutenant, I was at some point responsible for conducting all disciplinary investigations in my company. I don't remember why specifically this responsibility fell to me, but at one time I carried the nickname the political officer, because I would regularly call soldiers into my office to question them. But there were no severe transgressions, I can assure you. And finally, our boy talks about the mighty DB601 engine. Just a few words about this one. There are many videos on YouTube about it, but it still is an impressive feat of engineering, producing 1100 horsepower from an inverted supercharged V12 engine. It sounds glorious. There are a few in operation today, and that supercharger whine always gives me goosebumps. Check it out. What a glorious noise. Anyway, see you in the next episode. Cheers.